Facebook, which, oh yeah, let me check. Just 5 likes so far on me speaking tonight. But anyway, but Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and texting and whatever are all vehicles for this cultural gift. 10 years ago, I used this very gift to email the most powerful man in the world. A man who controls hundreds of thousands of troops, countless death-dealing piloted and remote-controlled aircraft, missile-wielding surface and submarine vessels, and enough nuclear weapons that, assuming he would dare violate Urbana's nuclear-free zone, that he could reduce me to my constituent atoms in a matter of microseconds. In my email, I had the audacity to disagree with his impending decision to invade Iraq. Now, whether you agreed or disagreed with that decision is beside the point. The point is, I sent the email, somebody read the email, apparently, and nothing bad happened. I was not executed, I was not tortured, I was not arrested, I didn't even lose my job. I was thanked for expressing my opinion, because that is my right. Now, the idea of human rights, individual rights, is pretty new in human culture, and even the most open democracies are still far from perfect at guaranteeing them to all their citizens, and there are way too many societies still that don't even try. And yet, already in a matter of decades, this far from accomplished cultural idea has had a profound effect on both science and religion. Number one, in who does scientific and religious thinking. Did you know, for example, in 1960, about 1% of all doctorates awarded in physics were awarded to women? 1%. 50 years later, in 2010, 20% of all doctorates in physics were awarded to women. Still too few, but think about it. 20 times as many women proportionately today are working in that field as were working in 1960. In 1960, there was only a handful of African-American physicists. Today, 3% of all American physicists are black. Again, not nearly enough, but a significant change. The same is happening in some branches of religion. In my own church, in 1960, there were how many women clergy, Pastor Lane?
Not many.
Zero. Zero. Yeah, I know. The 1960s is a long way back. Today, it was men only. Today, nearly a quarter of all ELCA pastors, including our hosts, are women, and about half of all those preparing for ministry are women. The number of ELCA clergy of African descent, not so impressive, has gone from a handful to maybe 1.5%, but still progress. Why is that important? Think about it. Let's suppose that 100 geniuses in any given field are born in a generation. All right? I don't know how many there really are, but let's suppose there are 100. Now, you will immediately eliminate 50 of those geniuses because of their gender. Of those that remain, you get rid of maybe another 25% because they are of the wrong ethnicity. You eliminate more because they didn't have access to a quality education, and even more because they died in childhood from preventable diseases or they were executed by oppressive regimes. How many geniuses are left? 10? 5? 1? I don't know. We'll never know how many geniuses and therefore how much progress in science we lost. Human rights, basic human rights, widen the pool, deepen the pool of scientific knowledge and religious insight. Basic human rights also contribute to making both science and religion more accountable. For example, in 1932, physicians associated with the United States Public Health Service began a clinical study on the effects of untreated syphilis in almost 400 poor African-American sharecroppers in rural Macon County, Alabama. Despite the fact that just 15 years into the study, Researchers already knew that the newly discovered penicillin drug could treat all of these guys. They prevented their test subjects from receiving penicillin, reasoning that they were studying the effects of untreated syphilis. By the time the program was finally exposed and shut down in 1972, 28 of the original 399 men had died of syphilis, 7%. 100 more, a quarter of them, had died of complications of syphilis. 40 of their wives had become infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. Today, I hope, because we value the rights of all people more highly, such experiments, at least in the United States, are impossible. Is science as being accountable to the public sometimes a royal pain? Yeah. You know, I just finished reading Jerry Coyne's Why Evolution is True and Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth. And their frustration at having to defend their life's work to members of the public who know nothing about biology but attack the teaching of evolution from every angle, that frustration is palpable. And yet on the whole, I think scientific thinking has been enriched by being publicly accountable. I certainly know that everything I've learned as a very amateur naturalist, I've learned from scientists willing to teach an admittedly ignorant but very interested public. Religion has been similarly enriched by the progress of human rights. Years ago, I walked into a restaurant in central Minnesota, dressed in a black shirt, black suit, and a white collar across the front. Rushing to an ordination, knowing that I wouldn't have time to change at the church, I decided that I would just wear my collar as I drove and dash into the restaurant and get myself some lunch and dash off to the ordination again. To me, wearing the collar just said, hey, look at me, I'm a pastor in a hurry, wait on me. But from the looks I got to the diners and the restaurant, not all that far from a place where allegations of child molestation had been made against the pastor of another denomination, that collar meant something far more sinister. They didn't know me. They didn't know anything about me except I was wearing that little plastic tab. But they had learned that people who wear clerics and people who don't, there have been scandals in every religious body because religious leaders are also people. They had learned that clergy are not always to be trusted. That's a hard thing for clergy. But it's also a good thing. I am grateful that religious institutions, including my own, which were once much more hierarchical in the way that they distributed power, have become much more accountable to their lay people. Can that be a pain? Absolutely. Did you know I cannot spend one penny of my church's money without getting somebody else's signature? And all of my actions are subject to review. But they ought to be. So that the rights of the least powerful, most vulnerable member of my religious community are equal to mine. So thank you, culture. And thank those who courageously have stood up for those rights. Which brings me finally to what religion contributes to culture, and maybe to science if it would admit it. I have saved religion for last because for some reason it was the hardest to talk about. On the one hand, as a religious professional, there was a temptation to oversell the benefits of the institution I represent, and which of course pays my salary. On the other hand, as a religious insider, all too aware of its warts, blemishes, and shortcomings, there is a temptation to depreciate the institution I represent. Please feel free to extol religion's benefits or point out its flaws in the question and answer session or in the whatever you call that talk around session later on, which I anticipate with fear and trembling. My job here is to talk about religion's contributions. And while I thought of many, having preached more than 1,500 sermons over the years, many about the benefits of participating in religious communities, I'm going to confine myself to the two that I think are most important. Feel free to disagree. The first is hope. My good atheist friend, Richard Dawkins, whose Twitter feed I follow, whose work on evolution I admire, although not his work on religion, Dawkins would call the hope that religion offers a false hope. I respectfully but firmly disagree. But it may be helpful to talk about what I mean by hope. Hope is not just the dream of pie in the sky when we die, as those of Dawkins' ilk would call it. Although I do hope there's pie. It would be a really sad afterlife without pie. Preferably cherry, a la mode, but I digress. And I concede that hope does include life beyond death, with or without pie, for many religious people. But I also maintain there is more to religious hope than the possibility of a new life in a transcendent heaven or on a restored earth. Let me illustrate. On a Friday evening back in August of 2005, a scientist visited me in my hospital room. One thing that I've learned about scientists, real scientists, is that they always tell the truth, insofar as they know the truth, whether you like it or not. So, for example, a geologist might tell me, yes, you know, there's almost certainly going to be another great earthquake on the Cascadia Fault off the coast of northwest Washington, which will likely result in catastrophic damage and loss of life, even if she knew that my son and daughter-in-law and sweet, sweet grandbaby girl live way too close to that fault. A climatologist might say to me, oh, yeah, Roger, I'm afraid rising seas might cover a lot of those low-lying areas along the Atlantic or Gulf Coast, even if he knew that I've heard a lot of those low-lying areas, and I would really hate to see them inundated. An astronomer might tell me, yeah, you know, the Earth is almost certainly going to eventually be struck by another large asteroid or comet again, which could end civilization as we know it, even though I live on Earth, in civilization as I know it. That's what science does. It tells the truth, good or bad. Now, it has a lot of truth, good truth to tell us, but that wasn't the kind that this particular scientist brought me 8 years ago. It seems that while they were scanning my innards, he didn't say innards, to determine a cause for the pancreatitis that had landed me in the hospital, they coincidentally found a large mass on one of my kidneys. The nephrologist, as this particular scientist was called, told me that in his experience, a mass of this size and density was almost certainly malignant 95% of the time. And because biopsies of kidney cancer are notoriously unreliable, the only way that we could be certain would be to remove the kidney, examine the mass, and cross our fingers that the cancer was confined only to the kidney. Any questions? Have a nice evening. Now, as you can imagine, I experienced a lot of different feelings after this scientist left. But to my surprise, since I'm not known for my optimism, one of those feelings was hope. Not hope that the tumor would be benign, although to his surprise it was. And I got to keep most of my kidney. He got part of it, but it was the tumorous part. I didn't want that anyway, and that was fine. No, it was hope that no matter what happened, I was going to be all right. That night, I found myself feeling strangely peaceful. Why? Because I'm a pastor? What do you think, P.E.? No. No, all of us, I think, are born hopeful to one degree or another. And yes, our inbred hope can be buried under anxiety, as mine would be in the coming weeks, or despair, or depression, or cynicism, or ennui. But I think down deep in our inmost self, most human beings, most of the time, are hopeful we will be all right. What religion does is offer our innate hopefulness some powerful tools. For example, our scriptures are full of stories. Stories about people who struggled, who suffered, and yes, sometimes who died and yet were never abandoned by God. Religion inspires wonderful music which impels our souls, our spirits, our hearts, our minds, our neurons, whatever it is, to soar sometimes out of the deepest pit of despair. Handel's Messiah still gives me goosebumps. Religion offers us the discipline of prayer and makes the audacious claim that the power that made all things listens to my chaotic, inadequate thoughts and feelings, and that prayer puts me in relationship with the author of that infinite grandeur. And of course, for religious folk, prayer is not a solitary experience. In between my release from the hospital for pancreatitis and readmittance for what we thought would be a nephrectomy, thankfully they gave me a little time in between, members of my religious community came to my house, put their hands on me while I was lying on the couch, don't worry, it was good touch, and prayed. And let me tell you, it was an electrifying and empowering experience to be surrounded by caring people praying for me. In these and other ways, religion contributes to our hopefulness. And many scientific studies, not all, but many have shown that hopefulness positively affects certainly our quality of life and sometimes even the outcomes of our immune system. Over more than 3 decades of being pastor, it's been my joy and it's been my sorrow, but always a privilege to be allowed into people's lives as they are in the process of dying. As many of you know, that isn't easy, especially when they are people that you care about. But strangely enough, I have learned more about hope and about hoping from members of my religious community whom, scientifically speaking, had no hope left. Watching them face death with the tools our common religion has given them helps me hope, at least on a good day. Which brings me to the second contribution I believe religion makes to culture and perhaps science. Every once in a while at a social gathering, despite my best efforts to hide my secret identity, people discover what I do for a living. And I have found out that people are likely to respond in one of 3 ways. One is they tell me a story. I like stories. But these are stories I don't always know how to respond to. Stories about improbable events, good things which happen in their lives or the lives of somebody that they know, in spite of everybody's expectations, especially the experts. In other words, they tell me miracle stories. I never know how to respond to miracle stories because too often I've just been at the graveside or the bedside or in conversation with someone for whom the miracle did not happen. But of course, that concern about the difference in outcomes is my problem, not theirs. So I just smile and say, that's great, because it is. The second thing people are apt to do when they find out I'm a religious professional is hold me personally responsible for all the bad things that my religion has ever done over the last 2,000 years. Which I also don't know how to respond to because I had nothing to do with the house arrest of Galileo. I mean, I'm not that old. Or the Spanish Inquisition. Or the mission schools which Native American children were forced to attend. So I just nod and say, yep, that was pretty bad. Because it was. The third response is the most puzzling. People who apparently feel defensive when they find out I'm a pastor will say to me, well, you know, Pastor, you don't have to go to church to be a Christian. And I say, well, that's true. But why wouldn't you want to? Because maybe the greatest gift religion can give to anyone is the gift of community. Now, I know that there are a lot of organizations out there that can offer people community. Just the other day, I heard a story on NPR, maybe you did too, about a climbing community which helps disabled veterans scale new heights together. It sounded awesome. I also remember being part of a birding community back in Macomb, Illinois. And let me tell you, once you've slogged through swamps together, fallen through ice together, tripped over logs together, been attacked by owls together, you get pretty darn close. But the church offers people a community which transcends interest groups. You can find people in my church who watch birds and people who shoot birds. You can find people who rent apartments and people who collect the rent. People who own businesses and people who sweep the floors of those same businesses. You can find Cubs fans and Cardinals fans and Sox fans and non-baseball fans, which I don't understand at all, Republicans and Democrats and Greens and Libertarians at its best. Religion transcends politics, transcends class, transcends gender, transcends ethnicity, and reaches out and welcomes anybody who is seeking community at its best. Critics would point out that religion is often not at its best. Martin Luther King Jr. once called Sunday morning the most segregated time in America, and it may still be. People have accused congregations at times of bowing to the wishes of its richest members when decisions are made, and that certainly does happen. And gender bias is embedded in many religions' sacred texts. But despite its flaws, the ideal of community still holds all religions to the highest standard. And through that community, many lonely people, including myself decades ago, have found a place where people care. And a place to serve. Every Thursday morning, I look out my office window to see a line of people waiting to pick up groceries from our food pantry. I wish they didn't have to. I wish income were distributed more equitably in our society, but it isn't. And so our pantry relieves some people of having to choose between groceries and medicine, or groceries and rent. But we're hardly alone in helping people. There are many religious organizations in our community and around the world which seek not only to meet basic human needs like shelter and food and clothing and safe drinking water and proper sanitation and adequate medical care, but which also address the root causes of those needs. Lack of education, particularly for women. Lack of job training or the know-how in starting up micro-businesses. How to develop better agricultural practices. Exposing political corruption or oppression. And religious people aren't the only ones who serve the needs of others. There are many secular NGOs, non-governmental organizations. But while many people are motivated to help, religious people are mandated to serve by a power higher than anyone's individual conscience. Service is an essential part of our religious identity. Granted, we don't always do it, and we could always do it better, but over the years, decades, centuries, religious service organizations have served as motivators and examples. So thank you, religion, for providing culture and, yes, science with means that promote hope and stories which inspire service. You thought I was done. I almost am, but before I finish, one concluding unscientific postscript, as Søren Kierkegaard once called one of his books. If religious and scientific thinking have made such contributions to culture and each other, then why are they thought to be in this life and death struggle? Why are science and religion considered to be in conflict? They're not really in conflict. I mean, they are exploring the same cosmos. They're just doing it with different tools. Some years ago, when I was training to become an East Central Illinois master naturalist, sounded pretty impressive, doesn't it? I helped survey a section of the Middle Fork River. I was netting fish that had been brought to the surface by a mild electrical shock. It was pointed out that we wouldn't all get the same results because our nets had different sized mesh. And smaller fish captured by some would elude the nets of others. And so I think it is with scientific and religious thinking. Scientific thinking is really good at measuring physical phenomena. How big, how heavy, how old, how far, how related. Scientific thinking has already done a wonderful job of determining the nature of our physical universe, how it developed, how life evolved, even to some degree how my brain keeps producing these words. When religious thinking tries to fish in those waters, the how eludes its net. Our texts don't really tell us how. That's not their purpose. But similarly, when scientific thinking claims to have caught all there is to know about life, the universe, and everything in its net, many of us feel that it has failed to capture that which is most important in life. What does it mean? What does it matter? Who cares? Religious thinking has found, or at least we believe we have found, those rarest and most beautiful fish in our own nets. Could we be wrong? Sure. We're only human. But then Galileo was wrong about a number of things, and so is Darwin. Watson and Crick were wrong how many times before they discovered the double helix of DNA? Fred Hoyle was spectacularly wrong about ours being a steady-state universe. but following his theory to the end made for an interesting journey. And in the end, isn't that what life is? No matter what kind of thinking you're thinking, a journey. Perhaps science, culture, and religion should learn better to journey together.
Thank you very much. Just a few minutes for questions.
Yes, Randy.
I thought at one time I heard that you wanted to be a meteorologist.
I wanted to be many things. None of which I was successful at, although presumably I had been a pastor. Go ahead.
If you weren't a pastor, what would you be doing now?
I probably would be a meteorologist. That was something that really intrigued me. I'm a member of an organization called COCOROS, Community Collaborative Rainhail Snow Network, which collects precipitation in the area, and also which if Kathy lets me, I'm going to buy the equipment that lets me figure out See, that's what happens when you don't pay attention to the teachers. So yeah, I would be.
That sounds pretty scientific.
It is, and it's a lot of fun, and it's interesting to see. I find, and also as a birder, I have, and an amateur astronomer, I have found that citizen science does amazing things. My brother-in-law is part of this huge network of computers that is tracking incoming radiation for the possibility that they may be intelligent signals. And I can't, do you know what that's called?
CDS,
whatever that is, yeah. And so any one of you can be a scientist. I mean, you can contribute across a wide variety of areas. So that's one of the neat things, that you can be a scientist even if you don't really know very much. And your math is terrible. I can add and subtract, that's good. Any other questions? Yes?
How would you respond to the situation where science could actually show that something in Scripture is not true?
I will go back to what I said kind of in the middle of the talk, maybe it was earlier than that, which is I think that the language in Scripture is essentially poetic. And what I mean by that is that it is trying to convey a reality that is really beyond human understanding. Even in the parts that appear to us to be historical, and have a lot of historical material in them, I think that the point of that text tends to be theological rather than historical. For example, the story of Job. It was used to be assumed that that was an historical story, that this actually happened. Now we found a book that predates the book of Job by 1,000 years. But what's interesting is that the older book of Job does not have such a feisty Job. The older book of Job is just more pensive and everything, And this Job is shaking his fist at God. And what it says to me is that God is inviting us in that book, maybe even to shake our fist, but certainly to encounter God in a visceral way from the depths of our hearts, rather than the meek, polite prayers that Protestants tend to pray, particularly Lutherans who are very polite. So I think that in the debates that we get into over the historicity of a text, we get so caught up in that we forget why the text was. And I think that some of the scientific, I wouldn't call it scientific, but some of the historical approaches to scriptures have actually yielded some new meanings to what the text might mean. I'll give you one example, and I know I'm taking way too long to answer your question. But the first chapter of Genesis, I've always loved that chapter. But one of the current theories, and I happen, well, my vicar, Mauricio, told me that it's correct, so it must be. But,